Hello.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well today. Um, so Derek, I was thinking about Star Wars again.
What?
I know it's shocking that we would be thinking about Star Wars because, it's not like we're Star Wars fans or anything. But I don't know about you, but I know when I was a kid, I liked to imagine that I was a Jedi and that I could use the Force and that I would fight against the powers of the Galactic Empire.
See,
Um,
for me, I didn't know Star Wars until I was in junior high. And so there was definitely like, I didn't play that as a kid, but as a teenager, I knew the Empire was bad. And so that's what rocked my world. Like the prequels, I still struggle with. They have their place. But one of the things that is the story of the prequels that is worth looking into and worth considering is how on earth did they get this vicious emperor out of not what like where would this vicious emperor come from? And it tells a story that, well, maybe not my favorite, but it talks about a rise to power and how a vicious empire could even begin.
yeah, and so in the prequels, there um, there are growing conflicts in the Republic, and there's a lot of instability, and there's a lot of fear and not full on war is breaking out, but there's skirmishes, there's violence.
Full on war does break out, the Clone Wars. I mean,
Oh well, yes, that that is true. But in that, in this republic, Senator Palpatine is actually able to claim power and make himself the emperor because people were fearful of that instability. And so then we see with his rise to power and his concentration of power that it actually leads to injustice and oppression. Instability can lead to this creation of unjust systems. And so, like, the prequels all move to that point. And so then when we get to the original trilogy, which of course is episode 6, 7, and 8, we
four, five,
see,
and six. 4, 5, and 6.
gosh, yeah, you know what?
All
I
good.
wish we could re-record this so I'm not
No,
making
no
all
worries.
these Star Wars errors, but that's okay. You know where we're going with this. But ultimately, these systems of injustice come into existence with this concentration of power as it moves from a republic to the galactic empire under Palpatine.
One of the lines that always sticks with me from the third episode 3 is the fall of the Republic is to a resounding applause, that they willingly vote for this emperor, thinking that this one leader will be their perfect salvation. Only to know, because the older movies are 4, 5, and 6, that what it turns into is one of the most awful authoritarian empires ever. And but yeah, it started with a resounding applause because the people wanted it. It started as this, we need a strong leader to get us through this dark time. And that sounds very similar to how some things kicked off biblically too.
Yeah, so today we're looking at, it's a pretty big time period, but it's the time period of the kingdom, well, and kingdoms, and exile. And so we left off last week with the formation of the covenant people. We looked at the overarching themes of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Pentateuch, and those books end with the covenant people about to cross over into the promised land, into the land of Canaan. And so they do. And for a while, it's kind of a loose tribal federations. They're ruled by people called judges. But then Then they move into the time of
Well,
the United
before that,
Monarchy.
I
Yes.
want to take a minute to say that we also have the story of Joshua, which is the conquest of the land. That is one of those books that it's tough. It's a really tough book to read. But when we hear of the judges, it is definitely a setting that we are not very used to. One of the best ways I had someone explain it to me is it's like the Wild West. And the judges are kind of like the sheriffs. They're doing the best they can in a setting that's, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's God's people doing the best they can. And these judges are appointed by God to help provide justice in the midst of this very loosely affiliated kingdom, because it's a kingdom without a king. And it's only the judges that are able to enforce these laws. And so the book of Judges is full of action scenes. It is one of the most I don't know, action based books of the Bible. And the judges, they ruled on God's behalf, but it wasn't any one judge over the entire area. It was like these judges were kind of God's judges in the world to help keep the peace. So the Wild West is always the image prior to what happens next, and that's where I interrupted you. Forgive me. I just
Right. So it's really a period of tribes kind of staking out their place, and of course, in this ancient Near Eastern context, there were many other tribes of people, and there was conflict over land and resources, and so I mean, there was a lot of violence between the various tribal peoples, and so for the covenant people, there began to be a demand for a king. We want to be like the other nations. We want someone to stand at our helm as we fight for what is ours, as we try to find stability and security. And so that leads us into the time of the United Monarchy, where and we'll talk about this in a couple of minutes in a bit more detail, but the people say, we want a king, we want a king. And the prophet Samuel says, no, no, it's going to be bad news for you. But ultimately, God allows them to have a king. And so the first king is Saul. And then we have King David, who is probably the most well-known king, the man after God's own heart. And he took Goliath down with just a slingshot and a stone. But David establishes the capital for the covenant people in Jerusalem. And then his son Solomon is perhaps the most well known for building the temple there in Jerusalem. Now, this monarchy, this united monarchy under which all of the tribes of Israel, there were 12 of them, they existed as a united monarchy for a very short period of time. It only existed under Saul and then David and then Solomon. And then things just fell apart. And the monarchy divided into two kingdoms, uh, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And they existed that way for a couple hundred years. But all throughout this time, there was the constant threat of conquest from other peoples and from other empires. And eventually, both kingdoms experienced conquest. So the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722. And the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered a couple of centuries later by the Babylonian Empire. And that moved the covenant people into a really significant time period for them, which is the period called the exile. And during the exile, the wealthy of the southern kingdom of Judah, they were taken into captivity in Babylon. They became vassals Babylon. Now the poor folk were left on the land, but basically their kingdoms were no more. They were conquered by these other bigger, more powerful empires. Those who were
and the Assyrian Empire also conquered Israel, which had 10 tribes living in it, versus Judah, which only had 2 tribes. And so if you've ever heard of the lost tribes of Israel, it's because Assyria had a very similar policy to what the Chinese have been doing to the Tibetans, where they move them away from their land. They break up the communities intentionally so that the people lose their identity and are forced to assimilate into the Assyrian Empire. And so the 10 tribes of the north are called the lost tribes because they were assimilated into Assyria. And that's another part of the story that we sometimes hear people talking about, those lost tribes, and that's what that's in reference to.
Right. And so when we look at the period of the exile, that was a really significant time. In the Hebrew Bible, we see how the people of Judah are really wrestling with their identity. What does it mean to be away from the land that they saw that God had promised them? And what does it mean to be away from the temple, which was the central site of worship? Like, how do they function? How do they worship God in a foreign land under foreign rule? Now, the Babylonian exile, it was not very long. It was like a generation or two, and then they were able to go back to Judah, go back to Jerusalem, and were able to
Thanks to
rebuild.
Cyrus the Great
Cyrus
from
the Great, yeah.
Persia. Woo!
And so they were able to go back, and of course there was a lot of trying to figure out, okay, so now what do things look like? We've spent a generation or two in a foreign land learning what it means to be God's covenant people in a new way, but now we're coming back to the place where the temple is, and we're going to rebuild the temple, but has something changed? And so those are questions of identity. Are key in this time of both the monarchy and also the exile. So we're going to move back for a minute now to thinking about the monarchy and how they came to be a monarchy. But I want to suggest that one of the ideas that we want to focus on today is that moving to the monarchy was ultimately a bad move for God's covenant people because it led to injustice and exploitation. And according to the prophets, eventually led to exile. That exile was a consequence of all of this and what happened when they went to having a king. So there is this problem of the king and the kingdom. As we mentioned earlier, Israel really wanted a king for security, for success in battle, to be able to establish their own security and place on the land, and to be able to have their resources. And Samuel, who was a prophet, well, he had some words for Israel about what would happen if they asked for a king. And Derek, I think you have that text.
Well, yes, and to set this up, the people wanted a king because the other nations around them had a king. Never once did it say God wanted a king for Israel. Not once does it say that. And that's very important to name. This was the people looked at the nearby empires, nearby kingdoms, and said, well, they have this. Why don't we have this? And in some ways, it's like them keeping up with the Joneses. And I'll tell you personally, the more I try and keep up with the Joneses, the more I often find myself not doing what God often wants for me. And so the story starts with the elders of Israel coming to Samuel, and this is in 1 Samuel 8, in the first section. And the elders come, and in verse 6 it says, they said, "Give us a king to lead us." And the initial response is, "This displeased Samuel." So Samuel prayed, and God goes on and says, "Well, spell it out for him. Tell him what's going to happen." And so I'm going to read verses 10 through 18, because Samuel says exactly what's going to happen. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. They will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flock. Then you yourself will become his slaves. When the day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So the initial response is, "Hey, we want a king." And so Samuel prays to God, and God says, tell him what it's going to be like. And in this depiction, there's not a single good thing about having a king. All of your sons are going to end up in the military. All of your sons, if they're not in the military, they're going to be commanders and or make weapons of war or equipment for the chariots. And your daughters too. Your daughters aren't exempt either. They're going to be having to work as perfumers and cooks and bakers. And then all the stuff you own, king's going to take his share. Why? Because that's what kings do. Death and taxes, the only two things you can bank on. So right out the gate, Samuel just lays this out. This is not going to be good. And yet they still cry out. In 19, it says, "No, we want a king over us." And it's just like, this is one of those moments in scripture where I just facepalm. Like, I'm like, seriously? Seriously?
Yeah, and so what starts out as a desire, one, to be like the other nations, but two, a desire to have success, security, strength. Ultimately, what happens when they get their way is it ends up looking a lot like the empire that God liberated them from in Egypt. And so, obviously we can see all kinds of issues with that. And during this time, and especially as we move into the time of the Assyrian conquest, of the Babylonian conquest, the prophets, some of the major and the minor prophets, come onto the scene, and they have some things to say about the ways in which the kingdoms and the powerful are oppressing the vulnerable. So when the prophets have a critique, which is pretty much what the prophets do, they come onto the scene to speak truth to power. There are two main things or two main ideas that they critique. One is idolatry or false and empty worship, and two, oppressing the vulnerable. Like, those are the two things that they're always going on about. And for the prophets, those two things are related. I wanted to share a few passages that exemplify this, and we're not going to read the passages. I just want to summarize them. There are tons of these throughout the major and minor prophets, but here's three key ones. So a big one comes from Isaiah chapter 1, where God rejects Israel's worship practices because their hearts and their actions are corrupted. And it's demonstrated by all these practices of injustice and oppression. And so God says to them, hey, look, all of these things that you're doing to worship me, they're meaningless. So stop doing evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Like, this is who you are supposed to be. Of course, this harkens back to what we've talked about in previous weeks. Last week, when we thought about Israel, the covenant people, being blessed in order to be a blessing. That is their vocation. And God says, you've completely forgotten this. You've completely forgotten what it means to be my people.
And they even had in the law, make sure that you have a means of supporting the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the alien, which is why gleaning practices existed. So God had an eye for this. There was already this, make sure the most vulnerable are protected. But as kingdoms go, they become empires, and as empires go, they don't care about the weak or the powerless. Empires have never cared for the weak and the powerless. And so these prophets are piping up, they are crying out. The Holy Spirit is working through them to cry out and to say, you might claim to be a holy nation, but your actions are anything but holy. And this is why the prophets are so profound, is most religious writings, you don't see critiques in their own writings. And the Hebrew Bible itself, a huge portion of it are critiques of failures to live into that faithfulness. And so the prophets are incredible. They're incredible.
Another example comes from Amos, where God again declares rejection of Israel's worship rituals, of the festivals, of the offerings, of the songs, because they are empty performances that mask a society filled with injustice and exploitation. And God demands justice and righteousness for God's people, from God's people. So again, we have this condemnation of the separation of worship from God and doing good, doing justice. And so much injustice has arisen from the concentration of power under the monarchy, both the united monarchy and then the divided monarchies that follow. And then one more passage, just as an example, Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 11. This is a part of Jeremiah's famous temple sermon. And in it, God confronts the people of Judah as they gather at the temple. They falsely believe that because they have the temple, because they have this great grand space of worship, this visible symbol of God's presence, that they are safe from judgment. That somehow, by being able to say, this is the temple of the Lord, this is the temple of the Lord, Jeremiah says, those are deceptive words, because you think that you are in the right just because you have the right worship, but instead you are guilty of oppressing the vulnerable, of shedding innocent blood, of worshiping other gods, of worshiping idols, which can be literally worshiping other gods, but it can also be worshiping money and power and self-advancement, all of these things. So these themes are found throughout the prophets. It's a critique of empire. It's a critique of Israel's desire to have a king and be like the other nations, and what naturally comes out of that concentration of power.
One of the verses, just a single verse from the prophets that really speaks to me, and it speaks to me because there was the Nate Hogue song about it, but it's also because Reverend Randy Richardson said he's not planning on getting a tattoo, but if he ever gets a tattoo, it'll be Micah 6:8, and that's, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. And this is this reminder that the prophets are telling us, worship's good, it's not bad, but worship that is empty, if you do not care for those that are struggling, those that are hungry, those that are seeing injustice after injustice, if you are failing to do these things, then worship's hollow. And so we are called to live out faith, not just on one day a week when we worship, but every day of our life.
Right. And so when the covenant people then go into exile, when they're taken from the land, when they're taken from the temple is destroyed. They can no longer claim, it's the temple of the Lord. It's the temple of the Lord that we have, and therefore we are righteous and we're able to worship God. They're forced to take a look at themselves, to say, what does it mean to be a covenant people without the temple, without the land? What does it mean to be the covenant people under foreign occupation? They have to take a good look at themselves and begin to reflect and wrestle with, again, once again, their vocation. And it's actually during the time of the Babylonian exile, for instance, that things like Deuteronomy was put together. The book of Deuteronomy was put together, which is a reflection, a sermon, an extended sermon, basically, on how they interpret and understand the covenant that God has made with them. And throughout Deuteronomy is this continual call to, hey, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and God has liberated you. Hey, remember the vulnerable, remember your neighbor. And so we can see, if we know that Deuteronomy was put together during the time of the Babylonian exile, we can see how Israel is wrestling with its identity.
And not only did they put together Deuteronomy, yes, Deuteronomy itself was probably really pieced together. Major parts were written, all of that. So Deuteronomy is definitely like a boiled down version of this, but the Hebrew Bible itself, the Old Testament itself, the canon really kind of took its form during the exile, because when you don't have access to the temple and to the practices you've always done, well, what makes you a people of God? Well, here are our writings. These are foundational for us.
Here are our stories, our narratives that have shaped us. And we need to hold on to those and know them. And that's what we cling to. I mean, that's what was happening during the exile. And that's how they wrestled with their identity. But ultimately, you were going to say something, Derek?
This is also where synagogues got their start, was during the Babylonian captivity. There was never a synagogue prior to this, to our knowledge. Synagogues were how do we worship when we don't have a temple? And so the fact that there's a temple and synagogues for us in the New Testament, we just kind of go, oh, that's always how it's been. Prior to the exile, there were no synagogues. You went to temple or you didn't. And so during the exile period is when we see synagogues pop up, and this became a new way of practicing faithfulness.
Yep. But ultimately, the kingdom and the exilic periods, they asked the covenant people to more fully explore their identity. What kind of people are they called to be? And what does it mean to worship God? And through all of this is this theme of, there are people called to justice and righteousness. They're called to be a people who are blessed in order to be a blessing to the nations. They're called to love their neighbor, to care for the vulnerable, and that is integrally connected to worship of God.
Yep.
Yep.
So well, yeah, kingdom wasn't what they signed up for, but all the warnings were true. God told them what they were signing up for. They didn't read the fine print, or, well, it wasn't fine print. It was all caps. But needless to say, the kingdom was not perfect. And so when the kingdom was imperfect, the prophets piped up. They shed light onto it. And yeah, this is an important part of the story, though, that often is not known. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about talking about the exile is because this is one of the areas of Israel's history that is typically undertaught. We get a fair bit of Moses and Abraham. We hear the patriarchs and the matriarchs, but we do not usually hear about when the kingdom fails. And so this is a huge part. Where is God when everything comes crashing down? And to me in my life, that's usually when I've been looking for God, is when everything comes crashing down. And so God appeared in the exile in very real ways. And hopefully you're able to see that. And I look forward to our discussion this coming Monday, that we're going to further discuss this.
Well, thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
See ya.